A human body can begin losing its ability to function safely after only a few hours of severe heat without enough water. Yet for thousands of years people have lived, travelled, hunted, traded, and raised families in landscapes where summer temperatures can climb beyond 40 degrees Celsius. You stand beneath a pale desert sky and feel the scale of that achievement immediately. The ground seems to glare upward. Stone burns through thin soles. Dry air pulls moisture from your mouth before you even notice you are thirsty. There are no electric fans humming nearby, no chilled bottles waiting in a refrigerator, and certainly no cheerful weather app suggesting that you remain indoors. Instead, survival depends on something quieter, attention. You watch the sun, you notice the shadows. You learn when to move and when doing absolutely nothing is the cleverest possible decision. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And while you settle in, tell me where you're listening from and what the local time is there. Now, dim the lights and imagine that the room around you has dissolved into open desert. The first thing you notice is not the heat itself, it is the brightness. Sunlight strikes pale sand and limestone until the whole landscape seems to glow. Your eyes narrow instinctively. The horizon trembles. A distant ridge appears almost liquid, bending in the heated air. Every exposed surface feels hostile to touch. A dark stone left beneath the sun can become painfully hot, while a patch of shaded earth only a short distance away may feel surprisingly tolerable. That difference becomes one of your earliest lessons. Shade is not simply comfort here. Shade is infrastructure. Before permanent town, wells, or elaborate desert architecture, human beings already understand the value of getting out of direct solar radiation. A lone tree, an overhanging rock, the shadow of a cliff, or even a roughly stretched hide can make the difference between manageable heat and dangerous overheating. You begin to understand why desert movement is rarely random. A group crossing open country does not simply walk in a straight line because that looks efficient on a map. There is no map. For one thing, an efficiency means something different when the sun itself is draining your strength. You might angle toward a ridge because its eastern side offers morning shade. You may stop near a cluster of thorn trees even if they are slightly off your route. You may wait beside a rock wall while the shadow creeps slowly across the ground, following it almost as if the shade were a living companion. Records from later desert societies confirm a pattern that likely reflects much older behavior. Daily activity often bends around temperature. Work begins early, pauses during the fiercest heat, then resumes as the sun weakens. This sounds obvious from the comfort of an air-conditioned room. Standing here, however, it feels almost revolutionary. Modern habits encourage you to imagine that productivity means continuous movement. Ancient desert survival teaches nearly the opposite. Rest is not laziness. Rest is water conservation. Each step creates heat inside your body. Your muscles release energy. Your heart works harder. Sweat carries heat toward the skin, where evaporation can cool you. But sweat also costs water, and water is the one resource you cannot casually replace. So you learn restraint. The sun rises higher. Conversation grows quieter. Even children understand that midday is not the moment to race across exposed ground unless there is an excellent reason. Adults settle into whatever shade exists. Tools are put down. Animals stand still. Bodies loosen into positions that expose less effort to the day. You may feel sweat forming, though in very dry air it disappears quickly enough that your skin can seem strangely dry. This can be deceptive. You are still losing water. Thirst arrives later than you might expect. That is another dangerous lesson. Your body does not always announce dehydration with dramatic urgency at the beginning. At first, your tongue feels slightly sticky, your lips dry. Perhaps your head begins to ache. You feel less energetic, but you could easily blame that on the heat. Then decisions become slower. your attention wanders. A simple climb over stones feels unnecessarily irritating. The desert has a quiet way of turning small errors into larger ones. This is why experienced people do not rely entirely on thirst. They learn patterns. They know roughly how much water a particular journey requires. They recognize which parts of the day will demand more effort. They watch one another, especially the very young, the elderly, and anyone who seems unusually silent or confused. Knowledge becomes collective. You survive partly because someone else notices what you fail to notice about yourself. And there is another strategy, so simple that it almost sounds disappointing. You adapt. The human body can adjust to repeated heat exposure. Over days and weeks, sweating can begin earlier and become more efficient, and the circulatory system becomes better at handling heat stress. You do not become immune to dehydration. Of course, the desert does not hand out magical upgrades, but an acclimatized person can often function in heat more effectively than someone suddenly dropped into the same environment. This helps explain how communities can inhabit regions that seem almost impossible to outsiders. Scholars bicker over exactly how much early human desert expansion depended on physiological acclimatization compared with cultural knowledge such as shade use, water planning, and seasonal migration. The answer is probably not one neat solution. Biology and behavior work together, each compensating for the limits of the other. Your body learns, your community remembers, and the landscape gives clues. Look at the ground near your feet. The sand itself tells you when not to move. Early in the morning it feels cool. By midday it can scorch. Near sunset it begins releasing stored warmth into the evening air. Stone behaves differently. So does packed earth. So does a dry riverbed. Someone who has lived here long enough develops a mental temperature map without ever using those words. You know which surfaces heat quickly, which slopes receive sunlight first, and where cool air sometimes settles during the night. Oddly enough, one of the most useful desert tools can be something you cannot carry at all: a shadow. Experienced travelers can estimate the sun's position from the direction and length of shadows. A short shadow warns that the day is approaching its most punishing period. A lengthening afternoon shadow quietly announces that movement will soon become easier. No clock is required. The landscape keeps time for you. You begin to notice that desert survival is less about defeating heat and more about negotiating with it. You cannot overpower the sun. You schedule around it. You do not demand that the environment become comfortable. You change your behavior instead. This may mean beginning a task while the eastern sky is still grey. It may mean eating before sunrise because cooking later would add unwanted heat. It may mean arranging camp so that shade will fall where people need it several hours from now rather than where it happens to be at the moment. There is almost an architectural intelligence in these temporary decisions. A hide stretched between poles becomes a roof. A rock face becomes a wall. A shallow depression becomes a cooler resting place. Even the direction you sit can matter if it reduces the amount of skin exposed to direct sun. Your senses grow sharper because they have to. You notice the faintest breeze moving along the ground. You smell dust warming beneath the sun. You feel rough stone under your palm and immediately pull away if it has absorbed too much heat. A distant bird call may suggest shade or water nearby, though following animals blindly can be a very poor plan. Some species travel farther than you can. Others obtain moisture from food in ways you cannot imitate. The desert rewards observation but punishes assumptions. That distinction matters. A curious footnote from desert travel traditions is how often experienced people distrust the dramatic instincts of newcomers. Someone unfamiliar with extreme heat may rush toward what appears to be relief, moving faster precisely when conserving energy would be wiser. The veteran response is usually far less cinematic. Slow down, cover yourself, find shade, think. Hollywood would be terribly disappointed. But survival often looks boring. That is the point. You sit through the worst hours, you ration effort. You let the sun pass overhead without challenging it. Around you, Life follows similar rules. Lizards vanish beneath stones. Small mammals remain underground. Birds seek branches that keep them out of direct sunlight. Even hardy plants reduce water loss through tiny leaves, waxy surfaces, deep roots, or seasonal dormancy. Humans, lacking thick fur or natural burrows, build behavioral equivalents. Shade becomes your burrow. Timing becomes your waxy leaf. Community knowledge becomes your deep root. By late afternoon, the atmosphere begins to change almost imperceptibly. The brightness softens first. Edges return to the landscape. Rocks that seemed flattened by white glare regain texture and colour. A ridge turns brown, then gold. Shadows stretch outward like dark pools. You feel the difference on your skin before the air becomes genuinely cool. Your shoulders relax and someone stands. Another person checks a bundle. A child who has spent hours being told not to waste energy suddenly becomes lively again. Because children remain children, even when living under one of the planet's most unforgiving suns. Movement returns carefully. There is no celebration. This rhythm is ordinary. That may be the most remarkable thing about it. What looks to you like an extreme environment is simply home to the people who understand its rules. They are not surviving through constant acts of heroism. They survive through habits so familiar that they barely need discussion. Stand here, wait now, drink before you feel desperate. Do not cross that exposed slope at midday. Use that shadow, watch the sky. Small instructions accumulate across generations until they become a way of life. And as evening approaches, the heat begins releasing its grip. The ground still holds warmth beneath you, but the air feels gentler. Sounds seem to travel farther. Somewhere beyond the rocks, an insect begins its thin, repetitive song. You have done very little for several hours, and that is precisely why you still have strength. The desert does not always reward the person who moves fastest. Sometimes it rewards the person who knows when not to move at all. So you remained beneath the lengthening shade, breathing slowly, feeling the stored heat rise from the earth and fade into the darkening air. Above you, the sky deepens, the glare disappears, your body cools. The urgency of the day loosens. For now, you're safe enough, resting inside a rhythm that human beings learned long before anyone measured temperature with numbers. You simply feel the world changing around you, and you know when the heat is finally beginning to let you go. Long before sunrise, the desert feels like another country. You wake beneath a sky crowded with stars, and for a few sleepy moments it is difficult to believe that this cool darkness belongs to the same landscape that can become merciless under full daylight. The sand beneath your feet has surrendered much of yesterday's heat. The air touches your face almost gently. Somewhere nearby, leather creaks as a bundle is tightened. Sandals scrape against stone. Someone murmurs to an animal that has absolutely no intention of beginning the day politely. This is the hour for movement. In a hot desert, choosing when to travel can matter almost as much as choosing where to travel. A route that feels punishing at noon can become manageable before dawn. Instead of forcing your body to work beneath the stronger sunlight, you borrow the cooler hours from the night. You rise while the stars are still bright. The group around you does not need a clock alarm. People recognize the progression of the night sky, the chill before dawn, and the first pale change along the eastern horizon. Familiar celestial patterns become part of the daily schedule. You begin walking. At first, your footsteps make surprisingly loud sounds in the darkness. Dry gravel shifts. A wooden container knocks softly against another bundle. An animal snorts, then settles into its pace. The temperature may be cool enough that you want another layer around your shoulders. That sounds almost ridiculous when you know what the afternoon will bring. But deserts are places of extremes rather than simple endless heat. Dry air and clear skies allow warmth to escape quickly after sunset. In some regions, nighttime temperatures can fall dramatically. Your body appreciates the change. Walking becomes easier. You do not immediately feel as though every movement is adding another invisible weight to your back. Your muscles still produce heat, but the surrounding air can remove some of it more effectively. This creates an obvious advantage. You can cover distance while spending less of your body's cooling system. Records confirm that many historic desert travelers, pastoral communities, armies, and trading groups adjusted journeys around cooler hours, often starting early or continuing into the evening. The exact schedule depended on terrain, security, season, animals, and destination. But the underlying logic remained beautifully simple. Do difficult things when the environment makes them less difficult. It is not heroic, it is sensible, and sensible people tend to last longer. As you continue, the sky begins to reveal the landscape piece by piece. First you see only silhouettes, a ridge, a cluster of shrubs, the angular outline of a pack animal. Then grey becomes brown, and brown becomes gold. You're already several kilometres from where you slept before the sun appears. That early progress matters psychologically as well as physically. By the time daylight becomes unpleasant, you have accomplished something. You're not beginning your journey beneath the worst conditions. You're already well into it. There is a quiet satisfaction in that. Of course, travelling in darkness creates new problems. You cannot see every loose stone. A shallow hole becomes an excellent opportunity to twist an ankle. Thorny plants seem to possess an almost supernatural ability to place themselves precisely where your leg intends to go, and animals that spend daylight hiding may become active at night. So darkness demands a different kind of attention. You walk more carefully, you listen, you rely on memory. Experienced travellers know the shape of routes through repeated use. A valley opening has a particular silhouette. A line of hills points toward a known crossing. A distinctive rock formation confirms that you have not wandered sideways. The landscape becomes recognizable, even without full daylight, and above it all is the sky. Humans have used stars for orientation across many environments, but in open deserts the heavens can feel especially dominant. With few trees and broad horizons, familiar stars rise and set in predictable regions of the sky. Travellers can use them to maintain a general direction. You do not need to understand modern astronomy, harshest. You need patterns. That bright star appears there. This group turns around that point. That constellation reaches a certain position before dawn. Knowledge that sounds poetic can be intensely practical. No agreement has been reached on whether very early prehistoric desert travellers used sophisticated stellar navigation in the systematic way documented among some later societies. Archaeology rarely preserves a person's instructions for reading the night sky. What scholars can say with confidence is that humans are remarkably good at learning repeated visual patterns, and later desert cultures demonstrate how useful celestial orientation can become. So you lift your eyes, the sky functions as both direction and time. One cluster of stars sinks lower, another rises. The eastern horizon grows pale. Soon, you no longer need the heavens to show the path because the ground itself becomes visible again. But now another clock has started. The sun. Once it clears the horizon, the transformation can be startlingly fast. Cool air becomes warm. Warm air becomes hot. The pleasant sensation against your face disappears. Your pace changes. Perhaps you still have several hours of useful travel ahead, but now every hour costs more than the last. The group does not necessarily stop at the first hint of warmth. Instead, movement is judged carefully. People balance distance against exhaustion. If there is a known stopping place ahead, you may continue toward it. If the terrain grows difficult, you may slow. If animals are carrying heavy loads, their condition matters as much as yours. This is especially important when caravans become common across desert trade routes. A journey is only as successful as the animals carrying food, goods, shelter materials, and supplies. Driving them too hard during dangerous heat can ruin the entire expedition. Camels, where they're used, possess impressive adaptations to arid environments. But even camels are not magical walking water tanks that can be treated carelessly. They require management. They need rest. They have limits. The popular image of a camel wandering happily through endless furnace heat with a cheerful traveller on top is rather optimistic. The camel would probably like to speak with management. As late morning approaches, conversation becomes less frequent. Not because everyone has become solemn desert philosophers, but because unnecessary talking requires effort, and effort has a way of becoming increasingly unattractive when the temperature climbs. The pace settles into rhythm, step, breath, crunch of sand, soft jingle from a strap or metal fitting. Step again. You begin to understand how repeated motion can become almost meditative. You're not rushing toward the horizon, you're allowing distance to accumulate. A curious footnote from long-distance travel traditions is the importance of songs, chants, and repeated verses for maintaining pace. In several cultures, a rhythmic syncing accompanies work or animal travel, helping groups coordinate movement and making monotonous journeys feel more manageable. In desert conditions, rhythm has another benefit. It discourages unnecessary bursts of speed. You find a pace you can maintain. That may be less exciting than charging heroically across the dunes, but heroic charging tends to end with someone sitting down very suddenly and regretting several recent decisions. Slow movement is reliable movement. Eventually, the useful morning begins to close. The sun climbs high enough that continuing becomes less attractive. Now comes one of the strangest adjustments for anyone raised around fixed modern schedules. The day seems to stop, not end. Stop. You may still have distance to cover, tasks to complete, and a destination somewhere beyond the horizon. Yet the natural schedule overrides your impatience. People settle down. Animals are unloaded or allowed to rest where conditions permit. Meals may be small. Conversation becomes quiet. Sleep is possible. The middle of the day turns into an enforced pause. From a modern perspective, this can seem inefficient. Surely you should keep moving if you want to arrive sooner. But the arithmetic of heat says otherwise. Every kilometre travelled during extreme temperatures places more stress on the body than the same distance covered when conditions are cooler. The fastest journey on paper is not always the safest journey in reality. So you wait. Hours pass slowly. Then, little by little, the sun begins to descend. The change is subtle at first. The light remains fierce, yet there is a sense that the day has crossed its peak. Eventually the air begins to soften. Animals stir. Bundles are tightened. Feet return to sandals. You begin moving again. This second period of travel can stretch through sunset and sometimes into full darkness. Evening has its own atmosphere. The harsh whiteness of midday becomes amber. Long slopes glow red or copper. Your shadow stretches beside you until it seems to belong to another person walking in silence. Then the sun disappears. For a short while the landscape becomes strangely vivid beneath the remaining light. Every ridge stands sharply against the western sky, and then darkness arrives. If the moon is bright, night travel can become dramatically easier. A full or nearly full moon paints paths silver and reveals broad obstacles. You may be able to see enough of the terrain to continue without firelight. Moonlight also has an ancient advantage that requires no fuel. A torch sounds useful until you remember that someone must carry it, feed it, protect it from wind, and somehow avoid setting anything important on fire. Oddly enough, bright firelight can also damage your ability to see beyond the immediate circle of illumination. Once your eyes adjust to darkness, the wider landscape may become more readable than you expect, so fire is not always your best guide. Sometimes you walk beneath stars alone. The night becomes enormous. The silence seems deeper than it did during daylight. You hear noises that the afternoon hid completely. A distant animal, a small stone rolling down a slope, wind moving across dry grass, your own breathing. There is also danger in becoming too comfortable with cool air. You can still dehydrate. You're still working. The absence of scorching sunlight may make thirst feel less urgent, but your body continues spending water. Experienced travellers therefore treat nighttime movement as an opportunity, not an exemption from basic limits. You keep a steady pace. You pay attention to fatigue. You do not assume darkness has made the desert harmless. The desert is never harmless. It is simply different at different hours, and this may be the central secret of travelling through it. You stop thinking of a day as one continuous block. Instead, you divide it according to conditions. Pre-dawn belongs to distance. Morning belongs to steady progress. Midday belongs to patience. Evening belongs to movement again. Night may belong to travel, navigation, or sleep, depending on the journey. Time itself becomes a survival tool. You do not control the temperature, you control your schedule. That distinction changes everything. The modern clock says an hour is always an hour. The desert disagrees. An hour at dawn may carry you several comfortable kilometers. An hour at midday may leave you dangerously exhausted. An hour beneath a bright moon may become the safest part of a difficult crossing. So you learn not merely to ask where you're going, you ask when you should go. And under a sky slowly rotating above the dark sand, that question feels less like clever strategy and more like common sense written into the landscape itself. By mid-morning, the cloth around your shoulders begins to feel more important than almost anything else you carry. At first glance, clothing in a hot desert seems like a contradiction. Surely the sensible response to intense heat is to wear as little as possible. Your modern instincts may suggest bare arms, bare legs, perhaps a heroic amount of sunscreen, and a determined refusal to admit that the sun has already won. Ancient desert communities often discover something less obvious. Covering the body can help. You pull a loose length of fabric around yourself and immediately understand why. The cloth creates a thin layer between your skin and the blazing world outside. Direct sunlight no longer strikes every exposed part of your body. Dry wind moves through folds rather than scraping across bare skin. Dust settles on fabric instead of working its way into every crease. The garment is not heavy. That matters. Loose clothing behaves very differently from thick, tight clothing. Air can circulate between your skin and the textile. Heat can escape. Sweat can evaporate. At the same time, sunlight is blocked before it reaches the skin directly. It is a remarkably simple form of environmental engineering. You wear shade. Across ancient North Africa, Arabia, the Near East, Central Asia, and other dry regions, people develop clothing suited to heat, dust, work, and local materials. The exact garments vary enormously across time and place. There is no single ancient desert uniform. Despite the best efforts of historical films to put everyone in vaguely beige robes, some people wear woven linen, others use wool. That second material may surprise you. Wool sounds like something designed for a cold mountain rather than a hot plain. Yet loosely woven wool can be practical in desert conditions. It can insulate the body from intense external heat, while still allowing some airflow. It also provides warmth after sunset when temperatures fall. Your clothing must handle more than one problem. The desert is not simply hot. It is bright, dry, dusty, windy, cold at night, rough underfoot, and generally committed to making every exposed surface of your body uncomfortable. So the fabric around you becomes a portable barrier. Records confirm that linen was widely produced and worn in ancient Egypt, where hot conditions made lightweight plant fibre especially useful. Flax could be processed into fine cloth, and surviving textiles reveal impressive weaving skill. Wealthier people could possess finer, softer linen, while ordinary garments tended to be simpler and coarser. You run your fingers across a piece of woven cloth. The texture is not perfectly smooth. Threads create tiny ridges beneath your fingertips. The fabric smells faintly of dust, human skin. Perhaps smoke from a household fire. It is not glamorous. It does not need to be. Its job is to help you keep functioning. A long garment protects your legs from sunlight, scratches, blowing grit, and thorny plants. Wide sleeves can shield the arms while remaining loose enough for ventilation. A cloth wrapped over the head reduces direct heating of the scalp. This last detail matters more than it may seem. The top of your head receives strong solar radiation when the sun is high. Covering it can reduce direct exposure, especially when the cloth is light in colour and not pressed tightly against the skin. You adjust the fabric above your forehead. For a moment, the world seems less aggressive. The glare is still everywhere, but your face sits inside a narrow pocket of shadow. A head covering can also protect your ears and neck, places that are otherwise easy to forget until they begin to burn. Then the wind rises. Fine sand lifts from the ground. Suddenly the same cloth serves another purpose. You pull it partly across your mouth and nose. Breathing through fabric is not especially elegant, but it can reduce the amount of dust entering your nose and throat. Your eyes still sting. Sand still finds ways into places that should be physically impossible. Yet the covering gives you some defense. Oddly enough, ancient clothing is often multifunctional because carrying separate specialized items is inconvenient. A piece of cloth may shade the head, wrap the shoulders, become bedding, protect goods, serve as a sling, or provide temporary privacy. One rectangle of fabric can have a surprisingly active career. Its usefulness comes partly from simplicity. There are no zippers, no synthetic fasteners, no elastic. Pins, ties, belts, folds, and knots do the work. You adjust clothing according to the weather. A breeze appears, so you loosen it. Dust rises, so you wrap it more closely. Night approaches, so you add another layer. The garment changes function without needing to change identity. Colour also plays a role, though not always in the simple way popular explanations suggest. Light colours generally absorb less solar radiation than dark colours, which can reduce heating at the outer surface. Yet clothing performance also depends on thickness, looseness, airflow, material, and how far the fabric sits from the skin. Scholars still argue whether certain traditional dark desert garments actually create meaningful cooling through increased air circulation, or whether their benefit comes mainly from the insulating air layer produced by loose construction. Experimental results vary depending on wind, cloth thickness, posture, and other conditions. The lesson is wonderfully inconvenient. Colour alone does not explain everything. The desert rarely rewards single explanations. You look down at your own garment and notice the space beneath it. That pocket of air matters. If sunlight heats the outer cloth, some of that heat does not immediately reach your skin. Air trapped between layers can slow heat transfer. If wind enters from below or through openings, it can carry away some warmth. This makes loose construction important. Tight clothing traps sweat against the body and leaves less room for air movement. Loose fabric behaves more like a small moving shelter. You walk, and the cloth shifts with every step. Air enters, fabric lifts, then settles again. The movement produces a faint repeated sound, almost like paper being folded. Your clothes are cooling equipment powered by walking. There is another reason to remain covered: sweat. In dry air, sweat can evaporate rapidly, which is useful because evaporation removes heat from the skin. But if exposed skin is also absorbing intense sunlight, the body must deal with additional radiant heat. Covering the skin can reduce that incoming solar load while still allowing evaporation if the fabric breathes. The balance is delicate. Too much insulation can trap heat. Too little protection increases solar exposure. Local clothing traditions gradually settle into combinations that work reasonably well for specific conditions. This practical knowledge grows through repetition rather than laboratory measurement. A person wears something. It works. Another person copies it. A weave is adjusted. A sleeve becomes wider. A head cloth is wrapped differently. Useful habits survive. Poor ones quietly disappear. There is no fashion committee announcing that a particular robe has passed desert testing, although, judging by humanity's affection for complicated clothing rules, someone probably wishes there were. Footwear presents another challenge entirely. The ground itself can become painfully hot. You step onto exposed stone and quickly discover why sandals matter. Ancient sandals are often made from leather, woven plant fibers, palm materials, reeds, or papyrus depending on region and resources. Archaeological finds from Egypt include sandals preserved in tombs and dry environments, some astonishingly elaborate. Most everyday footwear is simpler. A sole separates your foot from burning ground, sharp stones, and thorns. That sounds modest until you try walking without one. The sole need not be thick by modern standards. Even a relatively thin barrier changes the experience of crossing heated surfaces. You feel pressure, you feel texture. You still know exactly where every stone is, but the worst of the heat does not pass directly into your skin. A curious footnote appears in the elite footwear. Some ancient Egyptian sandals carry decoration, symbols, or images associated with status and power. Footwear can therefore be both practical and political. Even something designed to keep your soles away from hot ground can become a statement about who you are. Human beings apparently cannot resist turning useful objects into social signals. You might be trying not to burn your feet, but someone nearby is still judging the craftsmanship. For ordinary travellers, however, durability matters more. Sand wears things down. Rock cuts leather, plant fibers fray, straps snap. A sandal that cannot be repaired is not much use far from home, so simple construction becomes an advantage. You can replace a tie, you can patch a sole, you can weave fresh material if suitable plants are available. Repair knowledge travels with the wearer. Clothing itself requires constant maintenance. Fabric tears at the edge, threads loosen. Salt from dried sweat stiffens the cloth. Dust works into the weave. You shake garments out when possible. You mend holes. You wash them when water is available for such luxury, though drinking naturally comes first when supplies are limited. Smell becomes part of life. Sweat, leather, dust, smoke, oil, plant fibers, perhaps aromatic herbs stored with clothing if your household has access to them. No modern detergent cloud follows you through the landscape. Your clothes smell like your work and your environment. Head coverings can provide another subtle advantage by reducing glare. A cloth pulled low above the brow creates shade for the eyes, making it easier to look across a bright horizon. In a landscape where reflected sunlight from pale ground can be exhausting, even a narrow strip of shadow helps. You begin to understand clothing as a system rather than decoration. The head is covered, the neck is shaded, the torso is protected. Loose folds permit ventilation, the feet are separated from hot earth. Every piece responds to a different problem, and none of it requires machinery. The technology is woven. Spun fibers represent many hours of human labor. Flax must be harvested and processed. Wool must be collected, cleaned, spun, and woven. Leather requires preparation. Plant fiber sandals demand cutting, twisting, and careful construction. A simple garment carries hidden work. Someone grows the material, someone prepares it, someone spins thread, someone weaves, someone repairs. Clothing becomes part of a wider economy of survival. It is not merely what you put on in the morning. It connects agriculture, herding, craft knowledge, household labor, trade, social status, and environment. Even the way cloth is stored matters. Sand and insects can damage materials. Moisture, when it appears, can encourage decay. Dry conditions preserve some textiles remarkably well over centuries, which is why archaeologists occasionally recover delicate fragments that seem almost impossible to have survived. You hold the edge of your garment and imagine its future as a scrap in dry soil. Not very inspiring from your perspective. Perhaps extremely exciting to an archaeologist several thousand years later. The sun climbs. You tighten the head, covering slightly. The fabric brushes your cheek. The air beneath it feels warmer than open air, but the absence of direct glare is a relief. There is no miracle here. You still feel hot. Your clothes do not make the desert cool. They simply reduce the number of ways the environment can attack your body at once. That is often enough. Survival rarely depends on one perfect solution. It depends on many small protections working together. A loose sleeve, a shaded neck, a covered head, a sandal sole, a knot that holds, a fold that lets air through. Tiny decisions repeated across generations become clothing traditions that look ordinary precisely because they work. You walk beneath the pale sky with fabric shifting quietly around your body. The desert wind catches one edge and lifts it for a moment. Cooler air slips underneath. Then the cloth falls back into place. For something so soft, it performs remarkably hard work. Water is rarely where you want it to be. You stand on a dry plain beneath a white sky, and nothing in front of you suggests a stream, pool, or spring. The ground is cracked. Low shrubs cling to gravel. A line of distant hills wavers in the heat. If you came here without local knowledge, you might look around, see emptiness, and assume that emptiness is exactly what the landscape contains. But people who survive in deserts learn to read absence very carefully. You do not search for water only by looking for water. You search for signs. A patch of greener vegetation, a cluster of insects, birds moving repeatedly in one direction, a depression where runoff gathers after rare storms, a band of darker soil, a narrow valley cutting through stone. The desert keeps clues, but it does not place them politely beside a sign saying drinking water this way. You begin with plants. Some species can tolerate extreme dryness and therefore tell you almost nothing. A tough shrub growing alone on a stony slope may survive on moisture buried far beyond your reach. Other plants, however, prefer places where groundwater lies closer to the surface, where seasonal runoff collects, or where a spring dampens the soil. The trick is knowing the difference. That knowledge comes from years of observation. You learn which trees are merely stubborn and which are informative. You learn that an unusually dense patch of vegetation deserves attention. You learn to examine the shape of the ground beneath it. Perhaps there is a shallow channel almost invisible beneath dust. Perhaps the soil feels slightly cooler. Perhaps insects gather there toward evening. A newcomer sees bushes. You see a possibility. That difference can decide whether a journey continues. In many desert regions, dry riverbeds become some of the most important features in the landscape. They may be called different names depending on language and region, but their logic is similar. Most of the year they appear empty. During sudden rain, water rushes through them, sometimes violently. Then the visible flow disappears again, yet water can remain beneath the surface. You step down into a dry channel. The sand is lighter near the edges and firmer in the centre. You kneel and press your hand against it. Nothing. You dig. At first there is only hot, dry sediment. You dig deeper. The sand becomes cooler. That change catches your attention. Cooler soil does not guarantee water, but it can encourage you to continue. Eventually the sand may darken slightly. Moisture. Not a sparkling underground lake waiting 2 handfuls below your feet. Usually nothing so generous. Perhaps only damp sand that suggests water is collected deeper down. Now the work begins. You scrape carefully, creating a shallow pit. Water may seep into the bottom slowly. It is cloudy at first. Fine sediment swirls through it. You wait. Waiting is part of water gathering. A shallow seep may produce only a small amount at a time, so impatience achieves very little except muddying it again. Records confirm that wells and groundwater sources become essential to settlement and travel across many ancient arid regions. In Egypt, Arabia, North Africa, the Levant, and parts of Central Asia. communities develop increasingly sophisticated ways to reach and manage underground water. Some wells descend only a few meters, others require serious engineering, labor, and maintenance. But long before deep constructed wells dominate important routes, people can exploit naturally accessible groundwater, springs, rock pools, and seasonal channels. The desert is dry, not uniformly dry. That distinction matters. Rain may fall rarely, but when it arrives, stone and soil determine where the water goes. You begin looking at slopes differently. Rain striking bare rock runs downward quickly because little can soak in. It follows cracks, gullies, and channels. At the base of cliffs, water may collect in hollows. Between layers of stone, it may emerge as a spring. A spring can transform the meaning of an entire region. One reliable source can support plants, animals, camps, fields, and later permanent settlements. You hear water before you see it. Not a roaring river, a trickle, a wet sound against stone, in a desert. Such a sound feels almost extravagant. You follow it into a narrow shaded cleft, where dark rock is cool beneath your fingers. Moss or other moisture-loving growth may cling close to the source. The air itself feels different, just slightly softer against your face. You cup your hands, the water may taste of minerals, it may carry a faint earthy flavour. You do not complain. Your standards become beautifully flexible when the nearest alternative is a dry horizon. Springs can also create social geography. Routes bend toward them. People remember them, stories attach to them. Names survive for generations because knowing a water source is not trivia, it is navigation. One pool may be safe after winter rains but dry by late summer. Another may taste bitter but remain dependable. A third may fill only after storms in distant hills that you cannot even see. This knowledge is not interchangeable. You need details. Water memory becomes one of the most valuable forms of inherited information. You may hear an elder describe a place in terms that sound almost frustratingly vague. Walk toward the dark ridge. Keep the split rock to your left. Look for 3 low hills. Turn where the ground becomes pale. To a stranger, this sounds like a riddle invented by someone who dislikes strangers. To someone raised in the landscape, it can be precise. The landmarks are obvious once you know which ones matter. You also watch animals. This requires caution. Birds can reveal activity around water, especially species that drink regularly. But you must understand their habits. A flock flying at dawn or dusk may suggest a direction worth investigating. Tracks around damp ground can also reveal where animals gather. Yet animal signs can mislead you. Some desert creatures obtain nearly all the moisture they need from food. Others can travel much farther than you safely can. Following a determined bird across 20 kilometers of open country, because it looked confident, would be an unfortunate way to discover the limits of optimism. Oddly enough, even insects can become useful clues. Bees and certain flies often remain within practical range of the moisture because they need water or the plants associated with it. A sudden increase in insect activity around an otherwise barren hollow may encourage closer inspection. You do not chase one bee heroically into the wilderness. You observe patterns. That is the constant rule. Patterns matter more than isolated signs. A green plant alone proves little. A bird alone proves little. A cool depression alone proves little. But green vegetation, bird activity, damp soil, and a low channel together form a stronger argument. You become a detective whose suspect is groundwater. There is also water hidden in the stone itself, not literally inside the rock, but trapped in depressions carved by erosion. After rain, hollows in exposed rock can hold pools for days or longer depending on depth, shade, and evaporation. These natural basins become precious. You climb carefully over sun-warmed stone and find one tucked beneath an overhang. The water is not crystal clear. Leaves float on the surface. A beetle has apparently claimed part ownership. You remove debris and inspect it. People living in harsh environments often know which pools are dependable and which become dangerously contaminated. Where possible, water can be strained through cloth or allowed to settle. Boiling is useful when fuel exists and when people understand the practical value of heating water. Although ancient communities do not possess modern germ theory, they still learn through experience. A source that repeatedly makes people ill gains a reputation. A clean spring becomes favoured. Practical knowledge can exist long before anyone understands microscopic causes. The taste of water offers clues too. Very salty water increases your problems rather than solving them. Mineral-heavy springs may be unpleasant but usable in moderation. Stagnant pools require more caution than flowing sources. Smell matters. Colour matters. The presence of dead animals nearby matters very much indeed. Your senses become part of the testing process, though they cannot detect every danger. Scholars still argue over how often prehistoric desert populations deliberately dug for concealed groundwater rather than relying primarily on known surface sources and seasonal mobility. The archaeological evidence is difficult because a shallow pit scratched into a riverbed thousands of years ago rarely survives as clearly as a stone-lined well. What does survive is the larger pattern. Human occupation often clusters around water. Camps appear near ancient lake shores. Settlements grow around springs. Travel corridors connect dependable sources. Water shapes movement as surely as mountains do. You begin to understand why losing knowledge of a source can be catastrophic. Imagine a small group travelling toward a spring used for generations. The route is familiar, but this season has been unusually dry. The spring produces less than expected. Now every assumption changes. You cannot simply continue according to habit. You must decide whether to wait, turn back, seek another source, or divide the group. This is where environmental knowledge becomes flexible rather than fixed. People who survive long-term do not merely memorize where water once existed, they monitor it. A well can collapse, a spring can weaken, a flood can bury a pool under sediment, a storm can create temporary abundance where yesterday there was none. Conditions shift, so information must travel between people. Herders report what they have seen. Travellers share news. Visitors arriving at camp may bring more valuable information than any object they carry. The northern pool is dry. The eastern well still holds water. Rain fell beyond the ridge. Such sentences can redirect entire journeys. Water knowledge becomes social currency. And, unsurprisingly, control over reliable water sources can also become power. A family, community, temple, ruler, or settlement that manages a well controls access to one of the most necessary resources in the region. Agreements form around it. Customs develop. Rights of access may become formal. A council decree proves in some later societies just how carefully water can be regulated, with rules governing irrigation, wells, canals, and shared use. Even hospitality can become practical survival policy. Offering water to a traveller is not merely kindness in an arid land. It helps maintain networks of mutual obligation. Today, you drink at someone else's source. Tomorrow their relative may depend on yours. The desert encourages generosity partly because almost everyone understands what thirst can become. You fill a container slowly. The water looks ordinary. That is perhaps the strangest thing about it. No jewel could be more valuable here, yet it sits dull and transparent in a clay cup. You drink carefully. The first mouthful seems to vanish. The second brings your tongue back to life. You resist the urge to gulp too quickly. A small amount is passed to someone beside you, then another person. No one treats the source casually. Water dropped into sand is simply gone. So hands become careful. Containers are checked. Children are taught not to spill. Animals are brought forward according to need and available supply. Every movement around the source feels deliberate. The air near the water smells faintly of wet earth, a scent so different from dry dust that you notice it immediately. Your fingers touch cool mud. For a few minutes, the desert seems softer, but the pool, spring, or seep is not merely a pleasant interruption. It is the hidden structure beneath the journey. The hills may guide your eyes, the stars may guide your direction, yet water determines whether you can remain. And that is the deeper skill ancient desert communities develop. They do not wait until thirst becomes desperate and then begin searching randomly. They build mental maps of possibility. A green patch, a dry channel, a spring beneath limestone, a hollow in rock, birds descending at dusk. Cool sand beneath your fingers. One clue joins another until the empty landscape no longer looks empty at all. It becomes full of signs, and once you know how to read them, even silence begins to tell you where life might still be hiding. A full water skin is heavier than you expect. You lift it with both hands and immediately feel the weight settle into your arms. Water is wonderfully refreshing when it reaches your mouth, but before that happens, it must be carried, guarded, shaded, poured, divided, and somehow transported across ground that seems designed to make every burden feel twice as heavy. This is one of the great practical problems of desert survival. Finding water is only part of the challenge. You must make it travel with you. A person cannot simply scoop several days of drinking water into their hands and stroll confidently toward the horizon. Containers become essential technology, and ancient people experiment with whatever materials their environments and crafts can provide. Leather, animal skins, clay vessels, gourds, woven carriers lined with waterproof substances, wooden containers in regions where suitable timber exists. Each has advantages, each has annoyances, and every one of them becomes extremely important the moment the nearest water source disappears from sight. You begin with a skin container. The leather feels thick beneath your fingers, softer in some places where repeated handling has worn it smooth. It may have been made from the hide of a goat or another animal, cleaned, treated, sewn, and shaped so that openings can be tied securely. Filled with water, it bulges heavily. The first advantage is obvious. Unlike a rigid pot, the skin flexes. It can be tied to a pack animal, slung over a shoulder, or wedged among other loads. When partly empty, it collapses rather than occupying the same volume forever. That makes it useful for travel, but leather has personality. It stretches. It leaks if damaged. It can impart a taste to the water. Heat affects it. Seams require attention. A small puncture can become a serious problem very quickly, so you inspect it often. Your fingertips move over the stitching. You press gently around the seams. A dark wet patch means trouble. One tiny leak might not seem dramatic, but a slow drip continuing for hours can quietly remove a meaningful part of your supply. In a city, a dripping container is irritating. In open desert, it is an argument with mortality. You tighten the binding. The drip stops. That little repair may matter more than many impressive things people later carve onto monuments. Clay vessels solve different problems. You place a hand against the side of a ceramic jar and feel how solid it is. Pottery can keep water relatively clean, can be sealed with stoppers or cloth, and can be produced in many shapes. Some vessels have narrow necks to reduce spilling, others have handles for lifting or tying. Large jars work well in settlements, smaller ones can travel, but pottery breaks. This is its great weakness. One careless step on a rocky path, one fall from an animal, one poorly tied load, and your carefully stored water may suddenly spread across the ground in a glittering puddle. There is no dramatic rescue. The soil drinks first. You stare at the broken pieces. The desert is spectacularly unsympathetic. Potters therefore shape transport vessels with practical use in mind. Rounded forms distribute stress. Strong walls resist knocks. Narrow openings help control pouring. Records confirm that ceramic containers were central to water storage across many ancient societies, from households along the Nile to communities throughout the Near East and North Africa. Pottery fragments survive in enormous quantities because fired clay can remain long after leather, wood, and plant materials decay. Archaeologists sometimes reconstruct trade and settlement patterns from those fragments. A broken jar that ruined someone's afternoon 3,000 years ago can become an exciting discovery in a trench. History has a sense of humour. Ceramic vessels possess another useful quality. Some porous clay can cool water through evaporation. A small amount of moisture moves through microscopic pores in the vessel wall and evaporates from the outside surface. Evaporation removes heat, slightly lowering the temperature of the remaining water. You touch such a vessel and notice that its exterior feels faintly damp. The water inside may be cooler than the surrounding air, not icy, not modern refrigerator cold, but cool enough to feel deeply luxurious. Oddly enough, this means a container that appears to be losing a tiny amount of water may also make the rest more pleasant to drink. Of course, in severe scarcity, every loss matters, so usefulness depends on circumstance. A household with regular access to water may appreciate evaporative cooling. A traveller carrying a strictly limited supply may prefer a better sealed vessel. There is rarely one perfect container for every desert problem. The container also changes how water is distributed. Imagine several people travelling together. One person carries a large skin, another carries a ceramic flask. A pack animal carries two larger vessels balanced on opposite sides. Now the group possesses not one supply but several. That is safer. If one container fails, the others remain. Ancient people do not speak of risk diversification in the language of modern management meetings, which is fortunate for everyone involved, but the principle is easy to understand. Do not place your entire future inside one fragile jar. You also spread weight. Water is dense. 1 litre weighs roughly 1 kilogram, and several days of water for multiple people quickly becomes a formidable burden. You feel this reality the moment you lift a filled container. Your shoulders sink, your back tightens, a strap digs into your skin. Even if the weather were pleasant, carrying enough water for a long journey would be exhausting. This is where pack animals become transformative. Donkeys, camels in regions and periods where they are used, and other animals allow people to transport far more water than they could carry personally. But the animals drink too. This creates a wonderfully irritating calculation. An animal helps carry water. The animal also consumes water. So every journey becomes a balance between carrying capacity and consumption. You cannot solve this by adding more animals forever because more animals create more mouths. Desert logistics becomes mathematics performed with skins, jars, hooves, and experience. No chalkboard required. You estimate how far the group must travel. You consider the season. You consider the number of people. You consider the animals. You consider whether the next source is dependable. Then you decide how much water can safely be used each day. Rationing sounds simple until thirst arrives. When your mouth is dry, the idea of saving water for tomorrow becomes emotionally unpopular. The container sits beside you. You can hear liquid moving inside. You know exactly what relief it contains, and yet you may be told to drink only a measured amount. This requires trust. You trust whoever knows the route. You trust the estimated distance. You trust the next well. You trust that refusing yourself another mouthful now improves everyone's chance later. Social discipline becomes part of survival. The person controlling the water supply carries responsibility as well as authority. Too generous, and the group may run short. Too strict, and people may become dangerously dehydrated while usable water remains in the containers. There is no virtue in saving water so successfully that nobody is healthy enough to reach the destination. This is why experienced judgment matters. Scholars debate how formalized water rationing was among prehistoric mobile groups. Because organic containers and daily practices rarely leave clear archaeological traces. Later travel accounts and ethnographic evidence show highly developed systems of allocation, but projecting those exact customs backward is difficult. What can be said more safely is that any group carrying a finite supply across arid terrain must make decisions about consumption. The problem itself is ancient, whether or not the rules were spoken aloud. You learn another practical trick. Do not open the main container constantly. Every opening invites contamination, spills, and unnecessary handling. Smaller drinking vessels can be filled from larger reserves. A cup, bowl, or smaller flask gives people a measured portion while protecting the bulk of the supply. The sound of pouring becomes important. A short splash, then stop. No casual second serving. No dramatic washing of your face because you feel dusty. You are dusty. Everyone is dusty. Dust has won that argument. Water is reserved for higher priorities. Drinking comes first. Cooking may follow. Certain medical needs can demand water. Cleaning and washing become much more selective. Your standards change rapidly when you understand the cost of every cup. Hands may be wiped rather than thoroughly washed. Utensils may be scraped clean. Sand can even assist with scouring certain cooking vessels when water is too valuable to waste on generous rinsing. It sounds unpleasant to modern ears, yet conservation changes what counts as reasonable. One scandalous aside from ancient and traditional travel practices is that people sometimes become extremely creative about reusing liquids or avoiding water-intensive cleaning altogether. Survival does not always smell elegant. Civilization continues anyway. Storage location matters too. If a water vessel sits in direct sunlight, it becomes unpleasantly warm, so you keep containers shaded whenever possible. A skin may be covered with cloth. A jar may be placed behind baggage at a resting place. Vessels can be set against the cooler side of a wall or partly sheltered by earth. You do not leave your most valuable resource baking in full sun merely because the container can survive it. Warm water still hydrates you, but cooler water is easier to drink and can feel more refreshing. There is also the issue of contamination. Hands are dirty. Containers are reused. Animals stand nearby. Dust enters everything. A narrow neck helps limit debris. A stopper made from wood, cloth, fibre, or another material can reduce exposure. Some containers may be rinsed whenever enough water is available. Others retain strong smells from earlier contents. You take a sip from a leather vessel and taste animal hide, smoke, and something impossible to identify. You drink anyway. Desert life discourages unnecessary culinary criticism. Transporting water also shapes where people can go. A person carrying only a small container remains tied to closely spaced sources. A caravan able to carry large reserves can cross longer dry stretches. This changes trade. It changes migration. It changes communication. It changes which settlements can remain connected to distant regions. Water containers quietly expand the human map. A clay jar does not look like a tool of geographical transformation, yet fill enough jars, load them securely, and suddenly a route becomes possible that was once too dangerous. Technology does not always arrive as metal, wheels, or grand machinery. Sometimes it is a stopper that does not leak, a seam that holds, a strap that distributes weight, a vessel shaped so it can be tied securely to an animal. Small improvements accumulate. You notice this while preparing a load. Two containers must balance. If one side is heavier, their animal walks awkwardly, so you lift one, then the other. You pour a little from the heavier vessel. You adjust the ropes. The load settles evenly. A badly balanced burden can rub skin raw, exhaust the animal, or slide during travel. Good packing is therefore part of water management. Nothing is truly separate. The vessel depends on the rope depends on the knot depends on the person tying it, and everyone depends on the water remaining inside. You press the stopper firmly into place. Then you listen. No drip, no slosh beyond the normal movement. The container is secure. There is something deeply reassuring about that small sound of water moving safely inside a vessel. It is possibility made audible. A drink for later. A meal that can be cooked. A child who will not go thirsty. An animal that can continue. A few more miles of landscape becoming reachable. You lift the container again, and the weight has not changed. It is still awkward, still heavy, still demanding, but now you understand that the burden itself is what creates freedom. You carry water because water allows you to carry yourself farther, across the dry ground. Every skin and jar becomes a promise measured not in wealth, but in distance. The doorway is low enough that you duck slightly as you enter. Outside, the sun presses against the settlement with relentless brightness. The ground is pale, the walls seem almost white with glare, and every exposed stone feels as if it has been placed on a stove. Yet the moment you step inside, the sensation changes. Not cold, nothing so miraculous, but cooler. The light dims. The air becomes still. Your eyes need a few seconds to adjust, and your skin notices the difference before your mind does. This is not luck. The building is working in hot, dry regions. Ancient houses can become machines for managing heat without containing a single moving part. Walls, roofs, courtyards, windows, passages, and building materials all influence how quickly a room heats and how slowly it cools. You place your palm against the wall. It feels solid and faintly cool. The wall is thick. That thickness is one of its secrets. Mud brick, adobe, packed earth, and stone all possess something modern engineers describe as thermal mass. The material absorbs heat slowly during the day and releases it slowly later. You do not need the phrase thermal mass to benefit from it. You simply notice that the interior stays tolerable while the outside world becomes increasingly hostile. Across Egypt, Mesopotamia, Arabia, North Africa, and many other arid regions, people build with earth because earth is available, inexpensive, and surprisingly effective. Mud brick can begin as an almost embarrassingly simple mixture. Soil, water, sometimes straw or other plant material. The mixture is shaped into blocks and dried beneath the sun. No furnace is required for many everyday bricks. The desert that causes the problem helps manufacture part of the solution. You pick up a dry brick. It is rough and heavy, with bits of plant fibre visible inside. It does not look impressive beside dressed stone. But appearances are not the point. Stone monuments attract attention thousands of years later because they survive dramatically. Ordinary people usually need houses, not monuments. Records confirm that mud brick was one of the most common building materials in ancient Egypt, including for homes, workshops, storage areas, enclosure walls, and even parts of major institutional complexes. The great stone temples and tombs can therefore distort your picture of daily life. If you imagine every ancient Egyptian going home each evening to an elegant limestone residence, archaeology would like a quiet word. Most people live among earth walls, and those earth walls make excellent sense. During the morning, sunlight strikes the outside surface, heat begins penetrating inward, but thick walls delay that heat. Hours may pass before much of it reaches the interior surface. By then, the strongest part of the day may already be ending. At night, the stored warmth begins moving outward again as surrounding temperatures drop. The wall behaves like a slow battery for heat. You do not stop heat completely. You change when it reaches you. Timing becomes architecture. The roof presents a different problem. Sunlight falls directly onto it for much of the day, and a thin roof can turn the room underneath into an oven. So roofs may be built from beams, reeds, palm materials, packed earth, or combinations of whatever local resources allow. Extra thickness can help. Light-coloured surfaces can reflect some solar energy, and sometimes the roof itself becomes useful living space. You climb a simple stair or ladder and emerge onto a flat rooftop near evening. The difference is immediate. The walls no longer block the breeze. The air is moving as darkness approaches. The open roof can become far more comfortable than the rooms below. In some hot regions, families have historically slept on rooftops during warm seasons. The idea is wonderfully straightforward. If the bedroom is too hot, temporarily stop insisting that the bedroom must contain the bed. The night sky becomes your ceiling. A woven mat becomes your sleeping place. You feel the rough surface beneath you and hear distant voices from neighbouring roofs. A dog barks somewhere beyond the settlement. Cooking smoke lingers faintly in the air. The stars appear one by one. The house has changed function again. By day, the interior shelters you. By night, the roof gives you open air. Courtyards provide another solution. You enter a home arranged around an open central space. The courtyard may contain a tree, a work area, storage jars, perhaps a shaded bench or a small patch of plants if water permits. At first it seems like a simple gap in the building. It is much more useful than that. A courtyard can bring daylight into surrounding rooms without requiring large windows facing the street. It can provide secure outdoor space for cooking, craft work, children, animals, and household tasks. It can also influence airflow. Warm air rises from surfaces heated during the day. Cooler air can move through shaded passages and rooms toward the courtyard, especially when openings are positioned carefully. The exact effect varies with building shape and local wind, but the principle is intuitive. You create shaded interior zones connected to a controlled patch of sky. Instead of exposing every room directly to the sun, the house folds inward. Privacy improves too. That matters in crowded settlements. Windows facing narrow streets may be small, high, or limited. Large openings invite glare, dust, and unwanted heat. A smaller window reduces the amount of sunlight entering directly. It also reduces hot air flowing inside during the worst part of the day. Modern architecture often celebrates enormous glass walls. Ancient desert architecture would regard this idea with a certain amount of suspicion. Why carefully build shade and then replace the wall with sunlight? The question practically asks itself. Doors can be positioned with similar care. A doorway placed beneath an overhang remains shaded longer. A cloth curtain or reed screen allows some air movement while reducing direct glare. Interior rooms may open into one another in ways that create progressively cooler spaces farther from the exterior. You move through them. The first room feels warm, the next is dimmer. A storage chamber deeper inside feels cooler still. Food appreciates this arrangement almost as much as people do. Grain, oil, dried produce, and other supplies keep better when protected from direct sun and extreme temperature swings. Storage architecture is therefore part of heat management. A house does not merely protect bodies, it protects calories. In a place where producing food requires enormous labour, that matters very much. Some communities go farther and use the earth itself as insulation. You descend several steps into a partially underground room. The air changes noticeably. Soil surrounding the walls buffers temperature because underground conditions fluctuate less dramatically than exposed air. Caves provide the same advantage naturally. People occupying desert caves or rock shelters benefit from thick stone surrounding them on several sides. A cave entrance may blaze with sunlight while the rear remains comparatively cool. The stone smells faintly mineral and dusty. Your hand slides across a rough surface that has not felt direct sunlight all day. One curious footnote is that some desert communities later develop underground or semi-underground settlements on a remarkable scale. with rooms carved into earth or rock to escape both heat and wind. The idea can look exotic from a distance. From inside, it feels almost obvious. If the sun is the problem, putting several tons of earth between yourself and the sun is a fairly persuasive response. Ancient builders also pay attention to orientation. Where does sunrise strike first? Which wall receives the longest afternoon exposure? Which direction carries the prevailing wind? A building turned slightly differently can behave differently throughout the day. You notice this most strongly on western walls. Afternoon sunlight can be especially punishing because it arrives when the landscape is already hot. A thick western wall with few openings may protect rooms from that late blast of heat. Trees, walls, neighbouring structures, and covered passages can provide additional shade. Dense settlements sometimes create narrow streets for exactly this reason, whether deliberately designed or gradually formed. Walk into a narrow lane between tall earth walls and the sun disappears from much of the ground. The temperature underfoot changes. Your eyes relax. The street becomes a canyon of shade. Only a thin strip of bright sky remains overhead. This is one reason compact settlement patterns can suit hot climates. Buildings shade one another. The community creates its own microclimate. Of course, narrow streets introduce other problems. Airflow may become limited. Waste can accumulate. Animals and humans compete for space. And if you're attempting to move something large through the lane, everyone becomes suddenly very interested in architecture. There is no perfect arrangement. Builders balance competing needs: shade, ventilation, security, privacy, storage, access, construction materials, rain, even if rare, sandstorms, social customs, available labour. The finished house represents dozens of compromises made solid. Scholars bicker over how consciously ancient builders understood the thermal principles behind particular house forms. Some features may result from deliberate environmental adaptation, while others emerge from tradition, available materials, family structure, or urban constraints. The distinction can be difficult to prove. A builder does not need to calculate heat transfer mathematically to recognize that one kind of room feels cooler than another. Experience performs the experiment. Generation after generation repeats the successful result. You build thick walls because your parents did. Perhaps they explain why. Perhaps they simply say that thin walls are foolish. Either way, the knowledge survives. There are more active methods too. Water, when available in sufficient quantity, can cool air through evaporation. A damp cloth hung near an opening may slightly reduce temperature as air moves through it. Water sprinkled onto a courtyard floor can produce temporary cooling. Pools and fountains become more elaborate expressions of the same principle in wealthier architecture. But water is precious, so such methods depend on local abundance and status. A prosperous household near a reliable supply can afford comforts that a remote family cannot. Heat has a class system. The wealthy may possess larger shaded courtyards, finer screens, more rooms, gardens, and greater access to water. Ordinary households achieve similar goals with simpler materials: reed mats, awnings, small windows, packed earth, shared shade. You lift a woven mat hanging across an entrance. The fibres scrape lightly across your fingers. Behind it is a workspace where someone has positioned themselves away from direct sunlight. A clay jar rests against the wall. Tools lie on the floor. A spindle turns slowly in practiced hands. Life continues indoors while the day rages outside. There is no need to conquer the heat. The building reduces its reach. Even cooking is often arranged with temperature in mind. A fire inside a closed room adds exactly the sort of heat nobody needs. So cooking areas may be positioned in courtyards, on rooftops, near ventilation, or in separate spaces depending on local architecture. Smoke needs somewhere to escape. Heat needs somewhere to go. The smell of bread or stew drifts through an open space rather than filling every sleeping room. You hear fuel crackle softly. A pot lid rattles. Somebody complains about smoke choosing the least convenient direction, proving that certain household traditions require no archaeological interpretation whatsoever. As evening arrives, the building changes again. Walls that protected you from daytime heat begin releasing stored warmth. Doors open wider. People move into courtyards. Roof spaces become inviting. Cooler outside air is welcomed into rooms. The house breathes according to the day. Open now, close that opening later, hang the screen, move the mat, sleep upstairs, work downstairs. Architecture becomes a schedule made of walls. You stand in the courtyard as the first cooler air settles between the buildings. The earth beneath your bare fingers still holds warmth. The upper walls glow softly in fading light. A small breeze slips through a passage and brushes your face. Nothing mechanical has happened. No switch has been pressed. No engine has started. Yet the house has spent the entire day slowing heat, shaping shade, protecting food, creating privacy, and giving human bodies somewhere tolerable to exist. A wall can be more than a boundary. A roof can be more than protection from rain. A courtyard can be more than empty space. In the desert, every part of a home can become part of the climate. And as darkness settles over the mud brick walls, you begin to feel how carefully shelter turns a hostile afternoon into something ordinary enough to live through. Food becomes a different kind of problem when the air is hot enough to spoil fresh ingredients quickly. Water cannot be wasted, and firewood may be scattered across kilometers of dry ground. You sit beside a low cooking place as the scent of warm grain and smoke settles into the evening air. The meal in front of you is simple. There is no elaborate kitchen, no pantry packed with endless choices, and certainly no refrigerator humming faithfully in the corner. Instead, every ingredient has been selected partly because it can survive. Grain keeps, dates keep, dried meat keeps, salted foods keep, nuts and seeds keep. Fresh milk does not keep nearly as politely, so people transform it. Desert eating is shaped not only by hunger, but by heat, storage, fuel, distance, and the awkward fact that many foods require water before they become edible. You begin with grain. Across many ancient arid regions, cereals such as barley and wheat become enormously important because they can be dried, stored, transported, ground, and turned into several different foods. Records confirm that barley and emmer wheat were major staples in ancient Egypt, while barley also thrives in many environments where other crops struggle. A sack of dry grain may look rather uninspiring. It is, however, compact survival. You can store it for months under good conditions. You can grind it into flour. You can boil it into porridge. You can bake it into bread. You can trade it. You can measure taxes with it. You can feed workers with it. You can even turn part of it into beer, because humanity has never been especially willing to leave grain entirely sober. For someone travelling through hot country, bread has an obvious advantage. Most of the water required to make it has already been incorporated during preparation, and the finished loaf is easier to carry than a pot of wet porridge. You tear a piece from a coarse loaf, it is dense, a little gritty. Perhaps some fine stone dust from the grinding process has joined the flour, which is less delightful for your teeth than it is for an archaeologist studying dental ware centuries later. Still, the bread travels well. It does not slosh. It does not need a bowl. It does not spill into the sand because somebody trips. That makes it useful. Flatbreads can be especially practical because they cook quickly. A thin piece of dough placed against a heated surface or near hot coals requires less fuel than a thick loaf baked slowly for hours. Fuel matters enormously. In a desert or semi-desert environment, large trees may be rare. You cannot assume that every meal begins with an armful of firewood. Instead, people gather smaller branches, thorny shrubs, reeds, crop residues, dried dung, and other combustible material. None sounds particularly romantic. All can produce heat. You crouch beside a small fire. It does not roar. That would be wasteful. A few carefully arranged pieces of fuel create enough heat to warm a pot or bake bread. The flame is managed almost stingily. Cooking technology in an arid landscape often rewards efficiency. A covered pot keeps heat inside. A narrow fire pit protects flames from wind. Small pieces of fuel will burn where they're needed rather than heating half the landscape. A cooking vessel may sit directly above embers rather than a large open blaze. You become conscious of every branch. If fuel has taken an hour to gather, you do not burn it simply because a dramatic campfire would look nice. The desert has very little patience for atmosphere. Food preservation becomes equally important. Fresh meat spoils quickly in high temperatures. If an animal is slaughtered, the meat must be eaten, shared, cooked, dried, salted, or otherwise preserved. Dry air can become an advantage here. Thin strips exposed carefully to moving air can lose moisture rapidly. Removing water from food makes it harder for many forms of spoilage to progress. Salt can assist. Smoking can assist. Fat can sometimes be used to seal prepared foods from air. The exact methods vary widely between communities, but the goal remains familiar. You make tomorrow's meal less vulnerable to today's heat. A strip of dried meat feels leathery between your fingers. It requires effort to chew. Your jaw receives a small assignment, yet it weighs far less than fresh meat and can survive a journey much better. When added to a pot with grain or vegetables, it softens and adds flavour. That sounds ideal until you encounter one important problem: salt. Salt is useful for preserving food, but heavily salted meals can increase thirst. In a place where drinking water is limited, that creates an uncomfortable trade-off. You want food that keeps. You do not want food that leaves everyone dreaming desperately about a lake. Experienced cooks therefore balance preservation against consumption. Salty foods may be eaten with wetter meals when supplies permit, or in smaller amounts. A little preserved meat can flavour a larger quantity of grain. This distributes both taste and salt. Your meal becomes less about a giant portion of meat and more about using expensive ingredients efficiently. Legumes help. Lentils, peas, chickpeas, and beans appear in various ancient diets across dry regions because dried pulses store well and provide valuable nutrition. But they introduce another problem. Many require soaking or boiling. That consumes water and fuel. So, preparation methods matter. Some grains and legumes can be cracked or ground before cooking, reducing the time needed to soften them. Soaking can shorten cooking time if the soaking water is then incorporated rather than discarded. A lid prevents excessive evaporation. Even food preparation becomes an exercise in conservation. You do not pour cooking water away casually. If broth remains, you drink it. If grain has released starch into water, that liquid contains food energy. Discarding it would mean wasting both calories and moisture. The pot is scraped nearly clean. Modern recipe instructions sometimes tell you to drain something thoroughly and rinse it under running water. A desert cook might regard this with profound suspicion. Running water. For rinsing lentils. How extravagant. Fresh fruit provides another advantage when available. Dates become one of the great foods of many hot regions. A ripe date contains sugar, some moisture, and enough natural durability to travel well once dried. Date palms also create shade and can form part of complex oasis agriculture. You hold one in your hand, its skin is wrinkled, the flesh is sticky and intensely sweet. A small fruit delivers a quick burst of energy without requiring cooking. That is useful when fuel is scarce. Figs can be dried, grapes can become raisins. Certain melons and other fruits offer moisture during their season. Nuts provide compact fats and protein where available through cultivation or trade. Desert diets are not one monotonous bowl repeated across every region. They depend heavily on local ecology, trade routes, wealth, and access to farming. An oasis settlement may enjoy fresh vegetables and fruit that a mobile group rarely carries. A wealthy household may purchase spices, oil, honey, and imported foods. A poor traveller may possess little more than bread, dried fruit, and whatever can safely be obtained along the route. Heat affects class through food as surely as it affects housing. Milk offers a particularly interesting problem. Fresh milk is nutritious, but highly perishable. Pastoral communities therefore develop ways to transform it. Fermentation can turn milk into yogurt-like products. Further draining creates thicker foods. Churning can separate butter. Drying or salting certain dairy products allows them to last longer. The microorganisms involved are invisible to ancient eyes, but their effects are obvious. Milk that would sour unpredictably can be directed into a controlled fermented product. A curious footnote is that in several dry regions, fermented milk becomes valued not despite its sharp taste, but partly because transformation makes a fragile food easier to manage. You lift a small bowl. The smell is tangy. The texture is thick. Your modern breakfast aisle would recognize the general idea, although the packaging department would be horrified. Fermentation also appears in bread and drink. Ancient people repeatedly exploit microbial processes without knowing the microscopic organisms responsible. They observe. They repeat what works. They keep part of a previous batch. They maintain vessels that encourage familiar results. Practical science can exist without modern vocabulary. Cooking time itself becomes strategic. You avoid producing unnecessary heat during the hottest hours when possible. Meals that require fire may be prepared in cooler periods, as early morning cooking produces food before the day becomes severe. Evening cooking coincides with falling temperatures. A pot simmering at noon does not merely consume fuel. It adds heat to the space where people are already trying to remain comfortable. So the daily kitchen rhythm responds to the climate. Your senses notice the difference at sunset. Smoke becomes less oppressive. The air carries cooking scents farther. Bread warms without turning the entire courtyard unbearable. A spoon taps against pottery. Someone crushes seeds or herbs on a stone. The smell of onions, oil, or spice briefly defeats the smell of dust. Meals also help regulate labour. A large, heavy meal before difficult travel can make movement uncomfortable. Smaller portions eaten at practical intervals may be easier. People engaged in intense work need calories, yet digestion itself produces some heat, and overeating during severe conditions can feel unpleasant. There is no universal ancient desert diet plan, despite what a suspiciously confident modern wellness influencer might try to sell you. People eat according to availability, tradition, status, season, and necessity. Still, certain patterns make sense. Compact foods for travel, preserved foods for uncertain supply, minimal waste, careful cooking, use of seasonal abundance while it lasts. No agreement has been reached on exactly how much prehistoric desert populations relied on wild plant foods compared with hunted animals in particular regions and periods. Archaeological preservation complicates the question because seeds, soft plant tissues, and temporary meals often disappear more readily than animal bone or stone tools. Arguments split along different environments too. A lakeside population living during a wetter climatic phase faces completely different possibilities from a group crossing open desert centuries later. The desert itself changes over long stretches of time. Places that seem barren now may once have supported grasslands, lakes, or richer vegetation. Food strategies must change with them. Wild plants remain important wherever people know how to use them. Seeds can be gathered and ground. Roots or tubers may provide starch or moisture. Certain leaves can be eaten. Gums and resins can have nutritional or practical uses, but plant knowledge is extremely specific. One species nourishes you, another irritates you, a third becomes safe only after processing. Guessing is a poor survival method. You learn plants through community memory. Which fruit ripens now? Which seed is worth collecting? which root requires soaking, which bitter taste means stop immediately. Such information may never be written down. It lives in hands. You watch someone sort seeds and realize that they are discarding a few that look almost identical to the edible ones. To you, the difference is tiny. To them, it is obvious. That is what expertise looks like in daily life. Food also shapes mobility. If a region produces a seasonal abundance, people may gather there temporarily. If grazing improves after rain, herders move animals toward it. If date harvest approaches, labor concentrates near palm groves. If stores run low, trade becomes more important. The calendar is written partly in meals. You know what season it is by what appears in the bowl. And still, waste remains the enemy. A stale piece of bread can be softened in liquid. Broken grain becomes porridge. Bones may flavor broth. Fat is saved. Seeds are collected. Peels and scraps may feed animals if they are suitable. Food that requires labor to produce is not casually discarded. Every bite contains hidden resources: soil, water, fuel, animal effort, human time, transport, storage. You finish your meal slowly. There is grain at the bottom of the bowl, softened by broth. A few pieces of dried fruit remain. The fire has collapsed into red embers. You use the final warmth rather than feeding the flames unnecessarily. Nothing about the meal is extravagant, yet it accomplishes exactly what it must. It gives you energy without wasting precious water. It uses food that survives heat. It requires manageable fuel. It can be stored, carried, divided, and prepared with simple tools. That quiet practicality is what makes it powerful. Under a darkening desert sky, survival does not taste like a feast. Sometimes it tastes like coarse bread, dates, warm grain, a little salt, and the deep satisfaction of wasting almost nothing. Your body is not a fixed machine. Give it repeated exposure to heat, and within days it begins changing how it responds. At first, a hot landscape can feel almost overwhelming. Your heart beats harder than expected. Sweat seems chaotic. Your skin flushes. Even moderate work leaves you feeling strangely drained. Then something shifts. The heat has not become weaker. You have become better at dealing with it. This process is called heat acclimatization, although nobody living thousands of years ago needs the term. You simply notice that the work which exhausted you during your first days now feels slightly more manageable. Your body learns through repetition. One of the first changes happens in your sweat. When you're not accustomed to intense heat, sweating may begin later and distribute less efficiently across your body. After repeated exposure, the sweating response can start earlier. That may sound like bad news. More sweat means more water leaving your body, but sweating earlier can prevent internal temperature from climbing as rapidly, especially when the air is dry enough for evaporation to work effectively. Your skin becomes a cooling surface. Tiny glands release moisture. That moisture evaporates. Heat leaves with it. The mechanism is simple enough to describe, yet extraordinary when you think about it. You carry millions of microscopic cooling outlets in your skin, no clay pipes, no mechanical pump, no engineer wandering behind you with repair tools, just biology responding automatically to danger. Records confirm through modern physiological research that repeated heat exposure can improve the human body's ability to regulate temperature. Blood plasma volume can increase, cardiovascular strain can decrease during the same level of work, and sweating can become both earlier and more widely distributed. Ancient people cannot measure plasma volume. They can certainly feel the result. A task that once sends your heart pounding may gradually demand less effort. You recover faster. You tolerate longer periods of warmth. You begin recognizing the difference between being uncomfortable and approaching genuine danger. That distinction is valuable, Not every unpleasant sensation means catastrophe, and not every dangerous condition feels dramatic at first. Experience teaches you to read your own body, your pulse, your thirst, the heaviness in your limbs, the sudden disappearance of normal sweating under severe stress, the dizziness that tells you standing up too quickly was a poor decision. You become familiar with your personal warning signs. This knowledge is not written in a medical handbook. It grows from years of living inside the same body. Acclimatization also changes the composition of sweat. As your body becomes accustomed to heat, it can become better at conserving salt. Sweat may contain less sodium because your glands reabsorb more of it before the fluid reaches the skin. This matters because losing large amounts of salt can contribute to weakness and cramping. Your kidneys join the effort too. They help regulate water and electrolytes, reducing unnecessary losses when supplies are limited. The body becomes surprisingly stingy. It is as if several internal departments suddenly receive an urgent message that resources are scarce. Please stop wasting sodium. Please retain water. Please keep the heart functioning. Thank you for your cooperation. The endocrine system helps coordinate these changes through hormones that influence salt and water balance. You do not feel the hormones themselves. You feel their consequences. Urine becomes more concentrated. Thirst strengthens. Your body fights to preserve circulating fluid. Every adjustment buys time. None makes you invincible. That point deserves quiet attention. Acclimatization improves heat tolerance, but it cannot eliminate the need for water or protection. A person accustomed to heat can still suffer heat exhaustion. A lifelong desert resident can still become dangerously dehydrated. Experience shifts your limits. It does not erase them. That is why ancient desert survival cannot be explained by biology alone. The body adapts, but the body also depends on learned behavior. Children grow into local routines slowly. They watch adults. They learn how much effort feels reasonable. They recognize the sensation of thirst before it becomes severe. They notice which symptoms adults take seriously. In that sense, heat tolerance is partly cultural training. You inherit habits along with genes. A child raised in an arid environment begins encountering heat from early life. Those sensible caregivers protect infants and young children carefully because they regulate temperature differently from healthy adults. As the child grows, repeated exposure creates familiarity. Movements become economical. Posture changes naturally. You do not waste energy performing tasks in unnecessarily strenuous ways. Someone accustomed to manual work in heat may appear almost slow to an outsider. The movements are measured, efficient, nothing extra. Lift, carry, set down, rest the arm, continue. Economy of motion reduces internal heat production. Muscles generate warmth whenever they work. The harder you push them, the more heat your body must remove. So skill can become physiological protection. A person who performs a familiar task efficiently may produce less unnecessary effort than someone struggling through the same task for the first time. The difference looks small. Across hours, it becomes meaningful. Your posture matters too. You instinctively seek positions that feel cooler. You spread your limbs slightly when air is moving. You avoid curling tightly when the body needs to release heat. You shift away from surfaces that radiate warmth. These adjustments rarely become conscious strategy. The nervous system makes comfort-seeking decisions constantly. Even sleep can adapt. In hot conditions, sleep may become lighter or more fragmented when the body struggles to cool. People respond with flexible sleeping arrangements, shorter periods of rest, or sleep distributed across the day and night according to local conditions. The pattern depends heavily on culture and season. There is no single ancient desert sleep schedule. What matters is that human beings are capable of changing routine when environment demands it. A curious footnote from physiology is that people who regularly work in heat often report feeling more comfortable at temperatures that visitors describe as unbearable. Part of this reflects acclimatization. Part reflects expectation. Your brain interprets sensation through experience. If you expect a summer afternoon to be hot, its arrival does not feel surprising. If you arrive from a cool climate and encounter the same temperature suddenly, your entire nervous system seems personally offended. Perception does not cancel heat stress, but familiarity affects how you respond emotionally. Panic costs energy. Poor decisions cost more. Calm recognition can keep discomfort from becoming chaos. There is also the question of inherited physical traits. Over many generations, natural selection can influence human populations living under different climates. Body proportions are one example often discussed by biological anthropologists. Populations with long histories in hot environments sometimes show, on average, relatively long limbs and slender body forms, which can increase surface area relative to body mass and potentially help dissipate heat. The pattern is not absolute. Humans vary enormously within every population where nutrition, lifestyle, ancestry, migration, and chance all influence body shape. Still, climate may contribute over long evolutionary timescales. You hold out your arm. A longer, narrower limb exposes more surface to surrounding air relative to its volume than a shorter, broader one. The physics is straightforward. More surface area can make heat exchange easier. In colder climates, more compact bodies can help conserve warmth. In hot climates, slender proportions may offer advantages. But human evolution refuses to organize itself into neat classroom diagrams. People move, populations mix, environments change, culture alters exposure. A person wearing protective clothing and spending much of the day in sheltered conditions experiences a different selection pressure from someone constantly exposed. So inherited biology and cultural invention influence one another. Skin pigmentation provides another example of long-term adaptation to strong sunlight. Darker pigmentation contains more melanin, which offers greater protection against ultraviolet radiation. In regions with intense year-round sunlight, that protection can be important for maintaining biological functions affected by excessive ultraviolet exposure. Skin color does not prevent overheating. That misconception is worth discarding. Melanin primarily addresses ultraviolet radiation rather than acting as a simple heat shield. Your body still needs to regulate temperature through blood flow, sweating, behavior, and hydration. Strong pigmentation protects one part of the problem. It does not solve the entire desert. Scholars still argue over the relative importance of climate, ultraviolet exposure, diet, mobility, disease, and cultural practices in shaping particular human adaptations across ancient arid regions. The difficulty is that people are not stationary experiments. A population may occupy grassland during one climatic period, migrate toward a coast, return inland centuries later, and exchange genes with neighboring groups. The desert itself can transform dramatically. During wetter phases, parts of what are now immense dry zones contain lakes, grasslands, and abundant wildlife. During drier phases, populations retreat toward rivers, highlands, coasts, and isolated water sources. Natural selection therefore acts upon moving targets. Human survival comes from flexibility as much as specialization. This may be one reason our species handles environmental extremes so successfully. You do not need to evolve a completely new body every time the climate changes. You modify behavior first. Your physiology follows within limits. Your descendants may accumulate additional inherited adaptations over far longer periods. 3 timescales overlap: minutes, days, generations. In minutes. Blood moves toward your skin. Sweat forms. You slow your effort. Across days, acclimatization improves the response. Across generations, inherited traits may become more common when they improve survival and reproduction under persistent conditions. It is a layered defense. One system buys time for another. Your circulation plays a central role. When your core temperature rises, blood vessels near the skin widen. More warm blood reaches the body's surface. Heat can then move into the surrounding environment, but this creates a challenge. If more blood is near your skin, your heart must work harder to maintain circulation to muscles and vital organs. If you are dehydrated, blood volume falls. Now the heart has an even harder job. This is why severe heat and dehydration form such a dangerous combination. Your cooling system and your circulation begin competing for limited resources. Acclimatization helps partly by increasing plasma volume, giving the cardiovascular system more fluid to work with. You feel none of this directly. You simply notice that your heartbeat seems steadier during familiar exertion. Inside, the body is conducting a careful negotiation. Skin wants blood. Muscles want blood. The brain certainly insists on receiving blood. Sweat glands want fluid. Kidneys want to conserve fluid. Everyone has demands. There is no meeting room large enough. You breathe slowly and continue. Human noses and airways also participate in moisture conservation to a limited degree by warming and humidifying inhaled air and recovering some moisture during exhalation, though humans are far less specialized for this than certain desert animals. A camel remains annoyingly superior in several departments. You should not take it personally. Humans compensate with intelligence, cooperation, tools, and social learning. That social learning may be the most powerful adaptation of all. One person's experience becomes another person's advantage. You do not need to personally discover every warning sign of heat illness. Someone can teach you. You do not need to learn through repeated collapse that overexertion is dangerous. You can watch what experienced adults do. Knowledge travels faster than genes. This allows human groups to adjust to environmental change within a single generation. A new drought arrives. People change routines. A hotter season persists. Work patterns shift. A family moves into unfamiliar terrain. Local residents explain what sensations and conditions matter. Culture becomes a second nervous system distributed across the group. Your individual body is still central. You feel heat through your own skin. You carry your own pulse. You experience your own fatigue. Yet your understanding of those sensations comes partly from everyone around you. That mixture of biology and shared experience is what makes human adaptation so effective. You are neither a helpless body dropped into climate nor a perfect creature built specifically for desert life. You are something more adaptable. A body that can adjust, a mind that can learn, a community that can remember. And as your breathing settles and your heartbeat slows, the heat remains present without completely commanding you. Your skin glistens. Blood moves quietly beneath it. Salt is being conserved. Water is being guarded. Muscles relax between tasks. None of these processes asks for your attention. They continue in silence, ancient and automatic, helping you endure an environment that seems impossible only until the human body begins revealing how many small ways it knows to change. A desert path can disappear in a single afternoon. Wind crosses the open ground, lifts loose sand, and smooths away footprints until the route looks untouched. A familiar track that seemed obvious yesterday can become little more than a suggestion. Stones shift, dunes move. A dry channel changes shape after one sudden storm. Yet people still cross these landscapes. They do it because the route is not stored only on the ground. It is stored in memory. You stand beside someone who has travelled this way many times and realize that they are not seeing the same desert you are seeing. You notice hills. They notice the second notch in the western ridge. You notice scattered shrubs. They recognize a particular stand of thorn trees growing near an old seasonal watercourse. You notice a broad, empty plain. They know where the ground becomes too soft for loaded animals and where firmer gravel begins. The difference is knowledge, and knowledge weighs nothing. You can carry it farther than any jar. This makes memory one of the most valuable survival tools in a desert community. A route is not simply a line from one place to another. It is a sequence of decisions. Turn near the dark outcrop. Cross the dry channel above the narrow bend. Do not enter the low basin if clouds are gathering in the hills. Keep the rising sun on a certain side until the ridge changes shape. Such instructions can sound vague to an outsider. To an experienced traveller, they form a detailed map. There may be no paper involved. There may not even be a drawing. The map exists in stories, demonstrations, landmarks, songs, and repeated journeys. Records confirm that many historic desert societies preserve route knowledge through oral tradition, apprenticeship, and direct experience. Travellers learn not only where destinations lie, but where hazards occur, where animals can rest, where grazing may be found, and which stretches should never be attempted under certain conditions. You walk beside an elder who points toward a line of broken rock. The gesture lasts only a second. You remember it because you're expected to. That is how the training works. Children grow up hearing place names long before they personally travel to every location. A well may be mentioned during meals. A valley may appear in a family story. A distant grazing ground may become part of a seasonal plan. By the time someone finally visits the place, it is already partly familiar in the imagination. Names help organize this mental world. A place may be named for its color, shape, vegetation, an event, a family, an animal, or a water source. The name becomes a compressed description. Say it aloud, and people understand far more than geography. They may know whether the route is difficult. They may know which group usually camps there. They may know which season brings grazing. They may know whether strangers are welcome. Landscape and society become tangled together. You cannot understand one without the other. This is especially important because desert survival is rarely a purely individual achievement. A lone traveller carries only personal knowledge and personal supplies. A network of people carries information. Someone arriving from the north may report that a particular well is low. A herder may say that rain has fallen beyond the hills. A trader may warn that a route has become unsafe. A family may learn that pasture is exhausted near a usual stopping place. These pieces of information alter decisions immediately. The desert changes faster than a fixed map can always capture. Human conversation updates it. You begin to see hospitality differently. A visitor approaching a camp is not merely another mouth to feed. That visitor may carry news. Where have you come from? Who did you meet? Was there water? How many animals were grazing there? Did you see storm clouds? Is the track passable? Questions emerge naturally because information has practical value. One curious footnote is that in some desert traditions, asking detailed questions about routes and conditions is less idle curiosity than a kind of environmental intelligence gathering. You may think you're enjoying tea. Meanwhile, everyone is quietly updating a mental database. No tablets, no glowing screens, no password forgotten for the third time this week, just memory and conversation. Hospitality itself can also become a survival mechanism. A traveller reaching a camp exhausted or thirsty may receive food, water, shade, and temporary protection. At first glance, this appears purely generous. It often is generous, but there is also a deeper logic of reciprocity. Anyone who travels through harsh country understands that today's host may become tomorrow's guest. You help because the environment makes cooperation sensible. A rule of hospitality can therefore protect people beyond the boundaries of family. Custom performs the work that a formal emergency service might perform elsewhere. You enter a tent or courtyard as a stranger and discover that social rules matter almost as much as physical resources. Someone offers a drink, someone asks where you're going. Someone explains that a route you intended to take is a poor choice. That single warning may be worth more than the meal. A council decree proves that in some later settled societies, access to shared resources could be regulated formally, but mobile communities often depend more heavily on custom, kinship, obligation, reputation, and negotiated access. Who may draw from a well? Who has grazing rights? Who may cross a territory? Who must ask permission? Who is expected to offer help? These are survival questions disguised as social etiquette. Ignore them, and you may lose access to the very network that keeps people alive. Desert knowledge therefore includes people as landmarks. You know which family occupies a particular seasonal area. You know which settlement maintains a certain well. You know where relatives live along a route. You know whose animals are likely to be nearby during a certain month. The social map overlays the physical one. A ridge tells you where you are. A household tells you what help may be available. You learn weather signs in much the same way. A particular wind may signal changing conditions. Clouds over distant high ground can warn of rainfall that may never reach your location directly. That rain can still matter. Water may rush down channels hours later. A dry valley can become dangerous with astonishing speed. The sky above you might remain blue while floodwater arrives from somewhere you cannot see. People who repeatedly inhabit such regions learn which channels are risky. They know when not to sleep. They recognize the smell of wet dust carried from distant rain. They notice changes in wind direction. They watch the behavior of animals. Not every sign is reliable. Experience teaches which combinations deserve attention. Scholars bicker over how far back such detailed environmental forecasting can be traced archaeologically. Because warnings spoken beside a fire leave no fossil. Stone tools survive. A device does not. Yet the complexity of human occupation in difficult landscapes strongly suggests that accumulated environmental knowledge has been central for a very long time. You cannot occupy a harsh desert repeatedly by treating every storm, drought, and route as a complete surprise. Memory reduces uncertainty. Oral tradition becomes especially powerful because it can carry unusual events across generations. A disastrous flood may occur only once in several decades. If only the people who witnessed it remember, the knowledge disappears when they die. But if the event becomes a story, younger people may learn where the water reached. A tale about someone ignoring a warning can become a practical lesson. Stories make rare dangers memorable. They give information emotion. A dry instruction such as "do not camp in that hollow" may be forgotten. A story about a family awakened by sudden water is harder to dismiss. Human beings remember narratives. Desert communities use that tendency whether consciously or not. Songs can perform similar work. Rhythm makes sequences easier to recall. Place names can be arranged in order. Genealogies can encode connections between groups and territories. Poetry can preserve the qualities of landscapes. A line that sounds beautiful may also contain navigation. This does not mean every song is secretly a survival manual. Sometimes a song is simply a song. Humans are allowed to enjoy themselves. But oral culture can carry practical knowledge in forms that survive repetition. You hear a familiar phrase and know where the route turns. The words become part of the terrain. Teaching usually happens through participation. Younger travelers accompany experienced ones. They are corrected, not there. This way. Look at the slope. Notice that tree. Remember the rock shaped like a horn. Knowledge enters the body through repetition. Your feet learn the distance. Your eyes learn the horizon. You discover how long a particular stretch feels. You learn where people usually stop and which landmark appears shortly before a destination. This embodied memory can be astonishingly precise. A traveller may recognize that something is wrong before explaining why. The ridge sits at the wrong angle. The ground texture has changed too soon. A familiar hill has not appeared. You stop. That vague discomfort may prevent a serious navigational error. An outsider might call it instinct. Usually, it is experience moving faster than conscious explanation. Social memory also survives through specialists. Some people become particularly respected for knowledge of routes, animals, weather, plants, boundaries, or distant communities. A skilled guide can transform a dangerous journey. You're not paying only for someone who knows direction. You're paying for thousands of small judgments which fork in the valley. How far to the next stopping place is this wind temporary? Can the animals manage another hour? Is that distant green patch useful or misleading? The guide answers questions you may not even realize you should ask. This creates prestige. Knowledge becomes authority, but it can also become contested. No agreement has been reached on whether certain ancient desert route specialists guarded knowledge as a source of power or shared it widely within their communities. The answer likely varied according to place, period, family structure, trade, conflict, and resource scarcity. Some information benefits everyone when shared. Other information may be strategically valuable. A hidden water source is different from a public route. A seasonal pasture may be worth protecting. Human generosity has limits, especially when animals are hungry and rainfall has failed. Cooperation and competition exist side by side. You feel this complexity at a gathering place. Several groups meet, news circulates, people exchange food, goods, stories, marriages, arguments, and warnings. Children listen. Older people compare memories. Someone insists a distant source never dries. Someone else laughs and says it certainly did once, many years ago. The discussion becomes part of environmental management. Memory is checked against memory. One person's certainty is tested by another person's experience. This may be one reason communal knowledge can be more robust than individual knowledge. People correct each other. A mistaken memory does not automatically become truth if others remember differently. The social group acts almost like a living archive, not a perfect archive. Humans exaggerate. They forget. They boast. They confuse one year with another. But repeated conversation can preserve a remarkable amount of practical detail. You sit in the fading light and hear place names passing from voice to voice. Some lie far beyond the horizon, yet through description they become almost visible. A narrow pass, a bitter well, a valley where grazing lasts longer after rain, a ridge that looks purple at dawn. Each name is a point in a network. Each story ties one point to another. The desert is no longer an empty expanse. It is dense with remembered places. This is perhaps the quietest form of survival technology. Nothing shines. Nothing is carved in bronze. Nothing sits behind museum glass. It lives in conversation. It moves when people move. It can cross generations without adding a gram to anyone's load, and when the path disappears beneath fresh sand. Memory places it back into the world. Survival in the desert rarely looks dramatic from close up. It looks like a person checking a strap, a family storing grain in a shaded room, someone touching the ground before deciding where to sit, a traveller studying the horizon while everyone else sees only dust. Tiny acts accumulate until an environment that appears impossible becomes somewhere people can raise children, bury relatives, exchange goods, tell jokes, quarrel with neighbours, and complain that someone has once again misplaced the good water cup. That ordinariness is perhaps the most impressive achievement of all. Ancient humans do not conquer the desert in one grand moment. They make thousands of practical adjustments. Archaeology gives you fragments of those adjustments. A worn sandal, a broken water jar, the remains of a hearth, a line of mud brick walls, animal bones beside an ancient camp, seeds preserved in dry soil, a well cut into rock, a path through a mountain pass. None seems capable of telling a complete story alone. Together, they begin to reveal how human communities make extreme heat manageable. You kneel beside an ancient campsite. The fire is long gone. Only darkened sediment and scattered pieces of stone remain. Perhaps people rested here during a journey. Perhaps they stayed for weeks. Perhaps the place was visited repeatedly across generations. An archaeologist studies details that ancient inhabitants would never have considered remarkable. Where was the hearth positioned? Which animals were eaten? What plants were burned as fuel? Did pottery come from nearby or from a distant settlement? Are there grinding stones? Does the site sit close to an old watercourse? The smallest objects become clues because daily survival leaves patterns. Records confirm that human beings repeatedly occupied arid and semi-arid regions deep into prehistory, including landscapes that underwent major shifts between wetter and drier conditions. This matters because the desert you see today is not always the desert ancient people saw. Climate moves, rain belts shift, lakes appear, shrink, and disappear. Grasslands retreat. River systems alter course. A place covered in dunes today may once have supported vegetation, grazing animals, and seasonal water. You walk across dry ground and try to imagine reeds growing there. It feels almost impossible. Yet buried sediments can preserve pollen, shells, plant remains, and chemical signatures suggesting environments very different from the present. Ancient shorelines can remain visible around long-vanished lakes. Stone tools may appear where water once attracted both animals and humans. The landscape has a memory too. It simply records its memories in sediment rather than stories. As conditions dry, people respond. Some move. Some concentrate near rivers and springs. Some develop new ways of transporting supplies. Some depend increasingly on herding, trade, or cultivated oases. There is no single desert survival strategy because there is no single desert and no single ancient population. A hunter moving through a seasonally dry grassland faces different problems from a merchant crossing a barren plateau. A family farming beside a river experiences heat differently from pastoralists following grazing across open country. A settlement beside a permanent spring can build routines that would be impossible for a mobile group. The environment sets boundaries. Culture fills the space between them. This flexibility becomes particularly visible along desert edges. The boundary between fertile land and extreme dryness is rarely a sharp line. Rainfall changes from year to year. Vegetation expands and contracts. A good season can invite people farther outward. A series of dry years can pull them inward again. Human geography breathes with climate. You might spend part of the year near cultivated land, and another part guiding animals toward distant grazing. You might trade agricultural grain for animal products. You might carry minerals, salt, stone, shells, or luxury goods through areas where permanent farming is impossible. The desert becomes not simply a barrier, but a corridor. That is an important change in perspective. Empty-looking spaces connect civilizations, routes across the Sahara, Arabia, Sinai. The Iranian Plateau, Central Asia, and other arid regions eventually carry people, languages, technologies, beliefs, and goods. Crossing such places requires reliable knowledge. The farther you travel from permanent settlement, the less room there is for careless improvisation. Every additional distance magnifies small mistakes. A cracked vessel, a missed turning, an overloaded animal, a delayed departure, a wrong assumption about a source. None sounds dramatic at first. That is what makes them dangerous. Desert survival often depends on preventing emergencies rather than solving them heroically. You check equipment before leaving. You listen to people with recent information. You calculate what can be carried. You change plans when conditions change. Preparedness is quiet. Disaster is louder. History tends to remember the loud part. Daily life belongs mostly to the quiet one. A curious footnote appears in the archaeological record when researchers find objects far from the places where their raw materials originated. Shells from distant coasts, stone carried across long distances, minerals from desert mines, imported pottery. Such finds reveal connections stretching through landscapes that modern observers sometimes imagine as empty. Someone transports those materials. Someone knows the route. Someone reaches the other side. An object sitting in a museum case can therefore represent an invisible chain of successful journeys. You look at a small bead and see decoration. Hidden inside it may be hundreds of kilometers of human experience. Trade can encourage investment in routes. A frequently used track becomes better known. Stopping places gain importance. Wells may be maintained. Settlements grow where routes intersect. Political authorities sometimes attempt to protect, tax, or control movement. The desert begins acquiring an infrastructure of human expectations, yet infrastructure remains vulnerable. Drought can weaken it. Conflict can make a familiar route dangerous. A well can fail. Political control can collapse. Travellers must remain adaptable. There is no final victory in an arid environment. There is maintenance. That word sounds wonderfully unromantic. It is also the foundation of survival. A wall needs patching. A roof needs repair. A sandal strap needs replacing. A water container requires resealing. A well must be cleared of sediment. Stored grain must be protected from pests. Animals need check-in. Paths must be relearned when wind or flood changes them. Human occupation continues because someone performs these tasks repeatedly, not once, repeatedly. The desert demands maintenance because heat and dryness never stop working on your possessions. Leather cracks, wood dries, fibre frays, mud walls erode when rare rain finally arrives, pottery breaks, metal heats under the sun. Even knowledge deteriorates if nobody practices it. A route forgotten for a generation can become difficult to recover. You begin to appreciate repetition. The same knot tied correctly, the same wall repaired, the same child corrected when wasting supplies, the same place name spoken, the same inspection of a container before departure. These routines are not boring to the people whose lives depend on them. They are reassuring. Predictable actions reduce unpredictable risks. Scholars still argue whether technological innovation or social organization deserves greater credit for allowing humans to occupy increasingly difficult arid environments. One argument emphasizes tools, containers, wells, architecture, animal transport, and food preservation. Another stresses cooperation, inherited knowledge, trade networks, flexible mobility, and systems for sharing resources. Separating them may be impossible. A water skin is useful because somebody knows how to make it. A well matters because people maintain access to it. A route exists because knowledge passes between travellers. A house works because generations understand how to repair its materials. Technology without social memory can fail quickly. Knowledge without tools has limits. Human survival emerges from the combination. You can see this clearly in the simplest household. Someone shapes clay. Someone tends animals. Someone gathers fuel. Someone grinds grain. Someone teaches a child. Someone remembers where relatives camped during the previous dry season. Different skills overlap. No individual must personally master every task if the group can cooperate. That is one of humanity's greatest advantages in any difficult environment. You specialize, then share. The desert makes those relationships visible because isolation is expensive. Even competition does not eliminate cooperation completely. Groups may dispute grazing land or water access while still trading, marrying, negotiating passage, exchanging news, or observing rules of hospitality. Human societies are rarely neat. People can argue over a boundary in the morning and exchange information about weather in the evening. Survival does not require everyone to adore one another. A functional arrangement is often sufficient. There is something comforting in that. Human history is full of imperfect people creating systems that work well enough. You do not need flawless wisdom. You need enough good decisions to continue. Ancient people make mistakes. They sometimes misjudge conditions. They suffer droughts. Settlements are abandoned. Journeys fail. Communities move because circumstances become impossible. Survival is not evidence that every strategy succeeds. It is evidence that enough knowledge survives each failure to help people respond again. This is where archaeology can be humbling. An abandoned settlement may look like defeat, but the descendants of its inhabitants may simply have moved elsewhere. A dried lake does not necessarily mean the end of a people. It may redirect them toward a river valley. A failed pasture may push herders toward new alliances. Mobility can be resilience rather than collapse. The modern imagination often treats permanent settlement as success and movement as instability. In drier environments, refusing to move can be the more dangerous choice. Flexibility becomes a form of security. One scandalous aside from human behavior is that people also choose to live in difficult environments for reasons beyond bare necessity. Deserts contain trade routes, minerals, grazing, religious sites, political opportunities, family homelands, and places of deep cultural meaning. Not everyone stays because they have nowhere else to go. Home can remain home even when it is hot enough to make your sandals regret their career choices. People become attached to particular valleys, wells, mountains, and horizons. Knowledge turns landscape into belonging. A stranger sees emptiness. You see names. That may be the final transformation. Heat itself does not disappear. Scarcity does not disappear. The desert remains capable of killing the careless and overwhelming the experienced. But danger becomes legible. You know what conditions mean. You recognize which risks can be reduced. Human beings survive because they stop treating the landscape as random. Patterns become habits. Habits become culture. Culture turns extreme environments into lived worlds. You stand at the edge of a settlement near dusk. Children move between low houses. Someone repairs a basket. An animal complains loudly about something that probably does not deserve the level of emotional commitment it is receiving. Smoke rises from a small cooking fire. A few voices carry through the cooling air. Nothing about the scene announces triumph. That is precisely why it matters. People are not performing survival. They are living. Tomorrow there will be chores, containers to check, food to prepare, walls to patch, animals to tend, distances to judge. Small decisions will begin again, and beneath all of them sits an accumulated intelligence older than any one person. Not a secret formula, not a single invention, a way of paying attention. The kind of attention that notices when conditions shift before they become dangerous. The kind that respects limits without surrendering to them. The kind that turns knowledge into routine until survival no longer feels extraordinary. The desert remains vast. The sun remains powerful. But the human response is patient, and patience, repeated across generations, becomes its own form of strength. The voices nearby grow softer now. The warmth beneath the ground eases little by little, and the sky settles into a deep, quiet blue. You no longer need to measure distance or watch every sign. There is nothing to solve in this moment, only the faint smell of dust cooling, the smooth weight of darkness, and the soft certainty that people have rested beneath skies like this for thousands upon thousands of nights. Your shoulders loosen. The day has asked enough of you. Thoughts can become slower now, each one passing like a small cloud too thin to trouble the stars. The desert does not need anything from you. The path can remain where it is. The vessels are closed. The fire is fading. Somewhere beyond the houses, an animal shifts and becomes still again. You let the silence grow wider. Breathing becomes easy. The last warmth leaves the stones, and as the night settles gently over the earth, you can allow everything to become quiet, very quiet, until there is only darkness, cool air, and rest.